Hey Mike, so tell us about this beautiful piece right here, the Strategic Air Command. When was this last flown?
Oh gosh, this one, I'm not sure when this one was hauled off the line, but it had to be 20 years ago.
Because this has been here for a while.
This has been here for a while. This was used to train pilots here at Castle.
Oh really?
Yes.
That's
So
cool. Okay.
I didn't fly this actual airframe, but I flew one just like it. Matter of fact, it was just 3 numbers away from this one. But the A models were here used for training. So when I finished pilot training, I came here to learn to fly the tanker here at Castle.
Wow. And then
So-
what can fit in here? Actually, I would love to see the inside of it. What actually can all fit in here?
Well, all of the fuel is carried in belly bladder tanks.
Okay.
The upper part is a wide open deck that can be used for cargo. And you can also put passenger seats in. It has troop seats on the sides for hauling troops, and then we could put passenger seats in the center. Most of the time that I flew them, excuse me, we would haul cargo. So after I learned to fly this one here, then I went to Beale Air Force Base where the Q model, this is an A model.
Okay.
The Q model was specially modified to refuel the SR-71 spy plane. And I went through differences training there and then began to fly missions in the Q model. When we would fly overseas to our detachment, we would carry 30,000 gallons of fuel, and the inside would be full of about 80 maintainers and
Okay.
support people, and we would have cargo in the center. So you can actually load quite a bit on it.
I imagine. You know how much this thing weighs?
Yes, when it's empty, when it's totally empty, it's about 98,000 pounds. We always kept fuel in the forward body tank for weight and balance purposes.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay.
So that it wouldn't fall on its tail. We kept about 4,000 pounds up front. So somewhere around 102,000 was considered our empty weight. Our max takeoff weight was 297,000 pounds.
Wow.
Our ramp weight was 301,000. So you could fuel it above your takeoff weight, but it took almost 4,000 pounds of fuel to start, taxi, and take off. And so our takeoff weight was around 297. The newer tankers have been modified with bigger engines, better landing gear. They can go to 322,000 pounds.
How far does this, was this usually flown?
Well, if you were refueling, it didn't fly very far because you gave all your gas away.
Right.
But when we flew to Mildenhall, England from Beale, we would fly nonstop for 12 hours.
Oh, that's pretty impressive. Okay.
We would fly from Beale Air Force Base. We would fly the Great Circle Route up over the middle of Greenland and drop into Mildenhall, England. So about 12 hours.
Okay, well that is pretty impressive because yeah, with this size and that much fuel, I was like, wow, this probably can't go.
Yeah, the fuel, we always measure the fuel in pounds, not gallons, but most people want to know how many gallons. So it was about 200,000 pounds of fuel
Okay.
you could put in. But our typical offload to the SR-71 was about 70,000 pounds. So we would normally take off with a full load, fly to meet him wherever he was. Because he would, so whenever an SR took off, he normally refueled right away. Then he would go supersonic to the next refueling point, and he would fly his surveillance missions and then come back out. So it took a lot of tankers to support him. These guys here, the A models, would normally refuel fighters, they would refuel bombers. They would give a majority of their offload. So oftentimes they would have to divert to somewhere pretty close because they were almost out of fuel themselves.
So when people stopped flying the A models about, because those aren't really flown anymore.
The A models, like I say, were modified into the Q model, a few of them. I don't remember exactly how many Qs there were. There were
Oh, they actually modified the A models into, okay.
The A models became Q models. And then when they decided to extend the life, they started replacing portions of the wing because the wing was getting little stress cracks. They decided to put better engines. So now, the Q models became T models. There was also an R model, which is a little confusing. The Air National Guard ended up with ones that had been re-engined with surplus airline engines. And those became, let's see, those were called E models.
Okay.
E models. There were only a handful of those in Guard units, but now what they have is called the R model. So the Qs became T model. All of these were re-engined with big CFM 56 turbofan engines. The landing gear was beefed up to handle the extra weight, and those are all R models, and those all still fly today. There aren't any more A models. Most of the A models are in museums like this one. They were all converted to the other models, or they were sent to Davis-Monthan, where they've been mothballed in the desert there in Tucson.
And what models have you flown?
So I flew the A model here, and I flew the Q model.
So you haven't done the T model yet?
No, I won't be flying those. I'm out.
They're out of the game, yeah.
So I flew tankers from 1975 to 1980. Then I got out, went into the reserves, couldn't find a flying job. I ended up in the Air National Guard unit at Fresno. I did not fly the fighter there, but they had a transport plane that Bill alluded to earlier. I flew that one initially as just one of the pilots. I became the instructor pilot, the program manager eventually.
You can't talk about the mission?
Well, the primary mission initially was operational combat support, and we supported the entire state as well as the fighter unit. Eventually they modified it with sensors, and we became part of the drug war. And we were used nationwide to support law enforcement units with our surveillance equipment.
You have a lot of great stories that you can't share with us, sadly.
I flew that airplane for 13 years. I flew over 6,000 hours in that plane. But that plane has been, that program ended last year. Last year, the guys that I trained followed on and kept the program going.
Nice.
But there were only 10 of those airplanes flying in the United States. All of those have been given away to other government agencies, and that mission no longer exists. They did go to Iraq and Afghanistan, and they did fly missions over there as well, but that program ended. But I still usually don't talk about the stuff we did.
I have a question. For Open Cockpit Day, can people go inside this one?
Yes, they'll open up the cargo hatch, and you go up the ramp over here, and you get inside. You can see the cockpit.
And that's why everyone has to come to Open Cockpit Day, because it's so fun. It's so fun to go inside.
It's very interesting to see inside. You can go back to the boom pod. They won't let you get in the boom pod, but you can go back. They've got plexiglass guarding it, and they'll let you go into the boom pod or look at it and see where the boom operator would lay on his stomach. There's a little chin rest, so he could rest his chin, and he would then fly the boom. So the boom is actually flown into position, and then they extend the boom to plug it into the receptacle.
And how long could he be in that position for?
Well, usually we could offload 7,000 pounds a minute into one of the larger planes. The fighter jets couldn't take the fuel that fast, but if you were refueling a bomber or the SR-71, we could get rid of 7,000 pounds a minute. So 70,000 pounds only took 10 minutes.
Wow.
So he wasn't back there that long. When we refueled C-5s, which occasionally we did, even the Q models could be tasked to refuel something else. Because the fuel for the SR was special, you had to keep it separated from the other fuel. So JP4 was what everybody flew in the Air Force. The SR-71 flew JP7. It had a very high flash point. You couldn't mix them or it would damage the SR. And so because of that, if we had to refuel someone else, then we called it dirty tanks. They would put JP4 in all of our fuel bladders. That plane now could not refuel an SR until they flushed all that fuel out. They would have to put JP7 in and then flush all that out.
What a process that was.
It was quite a process. But in England, sometimes we would not refuel the SR there. He wasn't there. And so we would be tasked with bombers. You could refuel EC-135s, which were electronic warfare planes. The hardest one to refuel was the C-5 because he took so much fuel. And they would normally send 2 or 3 tankers to refuel him. And the bow wave off that bird was so severe that you couldn't let go of the stick. Normally you could hook up to a fighter and just relax.
Like a regular gas pump.
A regular, yeah, just like you're refueling an F4 there. You didn't have to hold constant pressure. In the C-5 you had to hold constant pressure. Because it would snap the boom.
Wow.
And so the boom operators would be back there, and we would normally take 2 boom operators because the first guy would get so tired, they would say, okay, disconnect, back up, swap in a new boomer, because you had to hold this constant pressure, and their arms would just get
Oh
tired.
my goodness, this is so impressive. It's stuff that you don't think about, you know, when you see this, about just how much work just went into fueling these jets.
Oh, tremendous amount of work, and it was also very dangerous. In the past, there were times when the receiver, through turbulence or whatever malfunction, would hit the back of the tanker,
Oh
and
my
it
goodness.
usually caused a lot of damage. There was only one tanker that went down from an impact. That was clear back in the 60s.
Oh wow.
I didn't start flying them till 75.
So things have been, the kinks have been worked out a little bit.
But these birds, this was a 50, I'm trying to remember. This was a 56 model, I think. I flew 59 and 60 models. In other words, by the time I started flying them, they'd already been in service for 15 or 20 years. They've now extended that life out past 60 years.
Do you happen to know where this plane came from?
This plane was stationed here at Castle.
Oh, so it never left then. That's one, that has a good story, but a lot of these came from like this place, this lot.
It may have been an operational tanker one time, but
wow.
it was here assigned to Castle for training purposes.
Okay. So it didn't have to migrate far like some of these other planes.
No, matter of fact, when they wanted to bring this one here, they just towed it off the line right over here.
Just right there.
Yeah.
Wow.
And like I say, they had a fleet of them here. I went through training here in 75, so this was a very busy base with tankers, bombers. This was the main training base for bombers and tankers for all Strategic Air Command.
Right.
So when I heard they were going to close this base, I was shocked, because this was the main training base for all bombers and tankers.
What was the replacement base?
They moved a lot of the tankers to Offutt, Nebraska. That's where SAC headquarters was. And of course, SAC doesn't exist anymore. They disbanded SAC. They now have Air Combat Command, and they have the Air Global Combat Group or something. It's all different. They reorganized the whole Air Force.
So what was one of the more difficult ones to fly? Since you've flown a lot of these different ones, what was one of the most difficult?
They were all they were all difficult to
In their
some
own
degree.
way, yeah.
The T-38 was more fun.
Yeah, I'm sure there were ones that you're like, well, that's the fun one, and this one
That's
is
the
a little.
fun
There's one that you're like, oh, I'm flying now.
These were difficult from the standpoint that they were so large. The avionics that we used in those days were very rudimentary, although compared to today, where they all glass cockpit. These used a single Q flight director, which was very new in the 70s at the time. That had been retrofitted, but it could be a handful to fly if you're trying to land at night in bad weather. It was a difficult airplane to fly. You can see how much wing you've got to play with. When you decided to turn, you had to make a reservation so you could turn the airplane. It did fly well, but sometimes it was very difficult physically to fly.
That's what I would imagine. I mean, that's what it seems like. So you're actually saying, yeah, that it was.
And the missions were long. Sometimes the missions were very long, and that got very fatiguing.
Right.
You could take naps every once in a while. You had two pilots. You had a navigator. You had a boom operator. So if one of the pilots was starting to fade out, you'd say, "Hey, take a quick power nap." I will tell you a funny story. It's way past the expiration date on this, but we were flying from the East Coast to England, and we had flown lots of missions just before we got there, so we were pretty tired. We took off late at night to fly all the way to England. Everybody was really tired, and so I told the aircraft commander, I was the co-pilot at the time, I said, "Hey, I'm just going to kick back, take a nap." And, okay. The navigator, who was taking sectionate shots every once in a while, we navigated by the stars. We didn't have the GPS back then.
Yeah.
He was between shots, and so he put his head down at his desk and he fell asleep. The boom operator, he'd been asleep since we'd taken off. So that left the aircraft commander. He nodded off. And so we were all asleep. We were on the autopilot, but we're in the middle of the Atlantic somewhere. And I finally wake up and I look over, and the whole crew is sound asleep, and I go, I wonder how long that's been going on. So we woke everybody up and say, "Hey, somebody's got to stay awake." Okay. But it would fly on the autopilot just fine.
Wow.
But those-
Did you know where how did you find out where you were?
Oh yeah, because you had star
You
shots.
saw your coordinates,
we,
yeah.
we were on course. It
That's
was on
good.
the autopilot. But that was a thing that didn't happen very often, but we tried to make sure that didn't happen. One of the pilots always
somebody has to be.
Somebody had to be awake. We called the autopilot George, and so we'd say, well, George is flying. We'd say, okay. That was our George, the autopilot. So yeah, this was probably, from sheer size and weight, this was probably one of the more difficult ones to fly. It wasn't quite as much fun as some of the other stuff I got to fly, but it was a challenge, especially if the weather was bad. We had some pretty scary approaches in England, because England would get fog rolling in all of a sudden.
Yeah. So how'd you guys navigate through that?
Well, you shot an approach and you hoped you got to see the runway, and sometimes we would cheat on our minimum descent altitude a little bit, because we'd say, I'm at 200 feet, I don't see anything. Well, let's go another 50 feet and maybe we'll see something.
Oh my
You always had alternates you could divert to. But there were times when you would get trapped and you'd say, hey man, all the alternates just went down. We got to land somewhere. So we ended up shooting an approach, and we descended below the normal decision height just so we could see the runway and land. And that was in Mildenhall, England. That was in 1976. That was pretty tense and scary for a young co-pilot. The aircraft commander at the time had flown tankers over during Vietnam, and he was pretty experienced. He eventually went on to the airlines. But he was the one that said, this is why I teach you all to fly perfect instruments. Someday you're going to need this. So he was a stickler on flying perfect approaches, which was good to learn.
Right.
Which helped me years later when I flew.
You really did test that theory. You flew everything.
Yes. So when I flew in the Guard, we got in situations where we had to shoot approaches to absolute minimums. The Navy could set minimums lower than the Air Force would set. So when we couldn't get into Fresno one day, we went to Lemoore, where the standards were a little lower, and we were able to land at Lemoore in the fog.
Oh, that must have been helpful, yeah.
Yes, but I learned to fly perfect instruments, and I taught all the guys that I was an instructor for that, perfection in instrument flying is important, because it'll save your life someday.
Yeah, especially in all this fog. And now people don't do that as much, right? I mean, isn't there a lot of restrictions now that there weren't back then as far as when you can fly, or not really?
Well, it depends. The military always tries to get the mission done. Civilians have a tendency, if you don't have to be there, don't go. Don't fly it. If the weather's bad, don't go. If the fog is rolling in, just stay on the ground. Don't fly today. The military has a tendency to say, hey, we got to get this mission done. Go fly to your alternate when you're done. There were times when we almost ran out of fuel. There were some scary, you wouldn't think you could run out of fuel with all the fuel we carried.
Yeah.
But under the right circumstances, we flew into Okinawa, Japan, Kadena Air Base at night, and whenever we would fly, we would normally stop in Hawaii and then get fuel and then go to Kadena. We had a go, no-go point, and if the headwinds were too strong, we would make a decision at that point. We would go to Guam, refuel, and then fly from Guam to Kadena. So we flew one night and went in, and we got our go, no-go point and said, hey, winds aren't bad, let's go. So we pressed on. Well, about an hour after we made that decision, the winds picked up. The headwinds got stronger. And I was doing the fuel calculations, and I said, we're gonna be min-fuel by the time we get there. You couldn't turn around and go to Guam because you'd already passed that point. So we went in at night. We declared min-fuel. We didn't declare emergency fuel, but we were minimum fuel. And we flew at night in a rainstorm, and the gauges had all gotten down to their lowest levels. And we knew we still had fuel because all the engines were still running, but when we landed, we were absolutely emergency fuel by the time we got on the ground.
Wow.
So even a tanker under bad circumstances can end up running out of fuel. It's rare. It normally didn't happen. It never happened again. We always...
just on the safe side every time.
Yeah, because the winds coming out of the, sometimes, because we would fly up pretty high. We'd be at 35 or 37,000 feet. You can get the jet stream coming at you, and that you can have 100 or 150 knot headwind. that makes a huge difference. So when we get to the go, no-go point, if there was even a hint that we were going to have a problem, we just go to Guam and get more fuel, and that happened quite regularly. Excuse me, coming the other way was better. If you got into the jet stream, you could go 800 knots of ground speed because you could have 200 knots on the tail. And so we would often fly from Kadena to Eielson, Alaska to get fuel and wait for a mission tasking order there. But we actually showed up an hour and a half early, and the base was like, "How did you get here so fast?" And I go, "We had a tailwind, we had a good tailwind." And of course, going from Kadena back home, sometimes you'd catch a big tailwind, and because of the international date line, sometimes we would land before we technically took off.
Wow.
Because we took off on the next day, flew across the international date line, landed at Beale Air Force Base an hour before
That's so funny.
an hour before we took off.
That's the interesting thing about flight and time zones.
Yes, and tailwinds. And so the jet stream, you know, they learned about the jet stream in World War II. And if you could find the jet stream and get in it, you could go pretty fast across the ground. So,
Well, thank you so much for showing us this, but I can't wait to see what's next.